as you all know, we are now truly appreciating the technological advancements that are happening. So, thanks to really to technology and everyone that is championing it and also adopting it and open-mindedly listening to what technology can make a difference. Um, and also, pardon me if in case you hear stuttered speech from me, because I'm a rare disease patient and sometimes I go through involuntary muscle spasms in the face, especially, and in the hands. So you will be hearing some stuttered speech now and then, and I'll try my best. Okay, thank you very much. As you see, the topic is the barriers in the technology and the breakthroughs to better serve community cancer patients. And as a moderator, a very brief introduction. I am Dr. Kamala Madali, and I am the Global Vice President for Strategy and Strategic Collaborations and Alliances at DPlus, where this webinar is being leveraged by DPlus, an artificial intelligence company focused on clinical trial patient matching. And I have the honor of introducing three of very well-respected speakers and experts in the industry. To start with, on the far left, in a beautiful sky blue attire, is Dr. Kashyap Patel, and
Thank you.
thank you, and a beautiful neutral, I would say, grid pattern shirt, which is always professional. It looks great on Dr. Dave.
Thank you.
And actually, you three have the same family, grays and blues, the combination. TJ Bowen, who is our CSO.
Hi, Kamala. Thank you.
Hello. TJ, is this gray or blue, light blue, or like midway?
It's a blue check pattern.
Oh, so thank you. And I don't want this webinar to be, just like something wherein I'm reading from a book. I love it as interactive, and a lot of people call me it's the Kamala show. So, welcome to the Kamala show, I must say. It's all about education. So to start with, I would love to introduce Dr. Kashyap Patel, who is on the far right, who is calling from South Carolina, a very busy person, trust me. I think next time if I meet him, he's going to pinch me. So it's like Kamala. So, he's a quadruple board certified cancer specialist, a very well respected oncologist in the community. He's a CEO of Carolina Blood and Cancer Care Associates. And he's also, obviously, he's a full-time practicing medical oncologist, board certified in hematology, oncology, and internal medicine. He's also the Vice President of Community Oncology Alliance, which is a national advocacy group for cancer patients. And he's the Chairman of Clinical Affairs and a member of Board of Trustees for the Association of Community Cancer Centers. And he's also an advisor for several divisions for the Department of Health and Human Services and local Medicare administration, Palmetto GBA. The list can go on and on. Pardon me, Dr. Patel, if there's anything else you want to add, feel free to add.
Let's just go to Dr. Dave.
No. One of the most important things, yes, I love Dr. Dave. Dr. Dave will understand, and he will appreciate that we are highlighting this. He is one of the very few, at least in my view, he's the only oncologist I came across in my life that has been an inspiring author. So, and he just released his book in September 2020 called Between Life and Death. These are real life stories and really moments that he had. A brief comment, Dr. Patel, on the book, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. So, as an oncologist, I always had a challenge of dealing with issue of, how do we tell people about death and dying? Because it's easy to start someone on treatment. I think the smart oncologist knows when to stop. Everyone knows how to start treating, but when to stop is kind of impossible to judge. And our system is actually in US, I would say, I've lived in 3 continents. We define winners and losers from the time that President Nixon say, I declare war on cancer. What is cancer? It didn't come from Mars. It's part of my own body, part of my own mutation. We're going to talk about mutations, and it started in my own body. So how can I fight war against my own body? So when we define the winners and losers, then it's hard for us to accept when to stop, because then we become part of the losing team. So I thought I want to change the discussion. So I started talking about death and dying process. I learned, actually, I'm trained in end of life care. I'm also certified in holistic and integrative medicine. And I used to conduct retreats for people to physicians to understand how to begin counseling on death and dying. So I compiled about 8 cases of my own, how beautifully they left this world. And Penguin Random House of India chose to publish it. In fact, I'm talking to a very big publicist in New York, and they feel that we could create a movement around living to the fullest and living gracefully. So that's my next theme. I'll talk about it later on, but I think, yeah, thank you for introducing and bringing my book here.
Thank you very much. No, it means a lot, right? We are here in the process of saving lives, and also caring and giving and healing is very important. Thank you for that. Now, Dr. Dave, I would like to introduce you to the group. Dr. Dave is a board certified oncologist and hematologist with more than 35 years of experience, as you see here on the slide, Dr. Harish Dave. I had the honor of personally working with him under his guidance while I was at Quintiles. Welcome to the webinar, Dr. Dave. Dr. Dave conducted over 100 studies in hematology, oncology, and transplantation. And he has extensive experience in managing regulatory authorities, including successful submission of over 50 IND. And he has extensive experience from both sponsor side of pharma biotech and also the CROs, clinical research organizations like IQVIA and Accelerants. And he has structured and executed a private equity NovaQuest sponsored strategic virtual drug development collaboration between Quintiles and Eisai. And he held various senior management positions, as I disclosed, not only at IQVIA, which was Quintiles prior to the IMS merger, George Washington University Medical Center, and VA Medical Center in Washington. Thank you very much, Dr. Dave, for joining. And Dr. TJ Bowen, who is the Chief Scientific Officer and co-founder of DPlus, who is on the extreme right on the camera. He actually brings a diverse set of skills to the team. And prior to joining DPlus, his career has spanned from cancer research to software development and strategy and management consulting. And his research focuses quite a bit on precision medicine aspects. Just a glimpse of his research, which is focused on pathological identification of tumor differentiation in breast cancers, especially with TP53 and P53 and BRCA1 and 2. He held several operating roles as the GM of the world's premium biology and pharmaceutical patent search software at CAS. And also more recently, Dr. Bowen was a founding leader of the software innovation team at Fuse by Cardinal Health, where his teams developed innovative products for healthcare providers, pharmaceutical companies, and patients. Thank you very much, everyone, for taking time. We will open the floor for the prepared questions, and I'll go ahead and click start. Before we kick start the questions, overall objectives. This is more for the audience who were generous enough to take time and attend the webinar today. So our objectives are to understand the cancer patient in the community setting, address the critical challenges in precision medicine, discover how technology could be used to free up vital resources, explore how you can reduce staff burden, learn how to strengthen connectivity between patients, care providers and sponsors via AI solutions, and learn how to operate data-driven clinical trials to provide the best patient care. And for the audience, please feel free to put questions, which will be addressed at the end of the session, almost in the last few minutes of the session. Thank you. Now, stay tuned, Dr. Patel and Dr. Dave. The first question. So by the way, hidden prizes, we will not disclose what the prizes are. We'll follow up. I'm just joking. So the question is, historically, the perception was that patients that go to an academic medical center or top cancer center for treatments and trials receive the best care. Is that still the case? If you don't mind, Dr. Patel, can you take up this question, followed by Dr. Dave?
Sure. So, it's a perception. And if you go back and look into the multiple publications that came out recently. In fact, there was one in NEJM, there was one in JAMA Oncology. They showed that the travel distance was linked to the access to the care. So if there's a big tertiary care center that was about, say, 100 miles away, the patients really chose not to go there. And also the second thing that they showed was that the proximity of the cancer center was linked to the stage of cancer. So the perception is not a reality. We are actually just outside Charlotte, and I still see, even within Charlotte area, many patients who revert back to us as small community clinics. There's a place for big academic center. They provide excellent, early stage studies. They provide excellent, say, I don't do CAR T cell therapy, I don't do TIL therapy, I don't do any of the vaccine therapy, and I don't do any transplant. So of course, I know my limitations, but in general, based on where I have practiced both in suburban and rural location, I think patients prefer treatment close to home because when you have cancer, if you have to take a week, every week, travel to like 100 miles long distance, they don't even have money to pay for their food. I mean, you look into half of the Americans who are retired barely make $1,400 a month. They may not have secondary insurance. So if they have to travel 100 miles one way, where they're going to get their gas from. So all of these are more perception. It could be more, I would say that, not in a negative way, but the marketing techniques. I think that patients prefer to be close to home because they need a lot of support. Cancer is not something that it's one and done. It's not a transactional, it's a journey. So I'll leave it to Dr. Dave for his kind of experience in that as well.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Patel. Dr.
I
Dave?
think, yeah, no, Dr. Patel, you make very good points, and I think the environment has changed quite considerably to perhaps when you and I were fellows to what it is
Right.
today. I think the fellowship programs, the training of medical oncologists has become so much better. That it's no longer the case that one says that, oh, if you want the best care, you got to go to a big academic center because that's where the smart people are. The fellows are very smart. All of them are very smart to get into hematology oncology. And we see that the community physicians are actually delivering top level care. What sense does it make? I'm not only economically to go long distances, but even if you're close to the city, where I am, for example, in Maryland, why would I want to drive into Washington, D.C., fight the traffic, pay $20 to park, and then wait for 2 hours to be seen for 5 minutes? When I can go to a community oncologist who's literally 2 or 3 miles away from me, who's got much easier access. Parking, you park right in front of the door and you walk into their office. So the multiple sort of soft factors that impact it. But in terms of level of care, if you set aside the very intensive therapies, leukemia induction, CAR-T, so of the newer therapies that we are experimenting with, which need a hospital setting, if you take those out of the equation, then the majority of the clinical trials and patient care can be given and should be given in the community setting. And we in fact find that there are a number of community sites that deliver excellent phase 1 clinical studies. They have the wherewithal in their unit. They don't necessarily admit overnight, obviously, but they've got their units, their offices set up so they can deliver even at that earlier stage. But phase 2 and phase 3, the community, that's where the patients are, and that's where, if we're going to get recruitment, we have to nurture and support the community sites so the patients will participate. Otherwise, we have no patients, we can't do any work.
That's a very valid point, Dr. Dave. It actually leads to very nicely to the next question, actually, where you're talking about how community, networks can be the center of excellences for trials, right? And I think it's also actually an opportunity to bring more and more awareness about leveraging more of the community networks. So in that regard, speaking about phase 1 and phase 2 and phase 3 trials, as you see the question here, this is for you, Dr. Dave. When you're designing a trial and finding the specific sites and PIs to run the trial, What are the factors that play into community site selection?
From my perspective, and I'm answering this both from having spent many years sitting in a CRO and now sitting on the biotech side, so I can see from both sides of the fence as far as pharma is concerned. From my perspective, I think the critical factor is an engaged and enthusiastic oncologist who wants to do clinical studies. And I think that perhaps might be a little failing in our fellowship training, is that we are not teaching the fellows or not perhaps pushing them hard enough to want to go into a clinical research type career, even in a community practice, because the attraction of clinical research here is that your patients can stay with you. It is something that enhances the reputation of the practice. Patients love it if you are able to deliver cutting edge therapies to them without their having to go many miles. They really appreciate it. So, and it's like anything else in life. If the investigator, the oncologist is enthusiastic and engaged, then the patients will be enthusiastic and engaged. Yeah, otherwise, we have, and I think you're going to touch on that later, this dismal recruitment rate of 3 to 5%. Yeah, we can't really get work done at that numbers, but you see this variability. There are certain sites that consistently deliver patients to us. And these are the sites, in fact, in private practice, because of their efficiencies, they are often the people who give you that first patient in on a study. They can do some pretty heavy lifting, which academic center with all this bureaucracy can get kind of bogged down into it. So what we look for is that enthusiasm at the site. From my perspective also, I would say, because many times community oncologists will come up to me and say, hey, I want to participate in clinical studies, but I'm not getting invited, I'm not getting a look into it. And there's this perception, which I think is wrong, that you got to always have an experienced trialist to take part in the studies. Any oncologist really should be able to take part in the studies. If they have the patient population, then it becomes incumbent on pharma and the CRO to supply the necessary support to help sure that all the whatever paperwork has to be done, whatever regulatory requirements are there, we can meet them. We should not throw the burden back onto the oncologist. And if we do that, more oncologists, I think, will participate in the study. And then the last point I want to make, and I'm sure Dr. Patel has views on this as well, is that we sometimes write protocols very, very badly. We forget, once you leave practice and you go into industry for a while, you know what the patients are like, and then you increasingly lose touch with reality, and you start asking for things in studies that are not practical. Patients will not agree to that, and therefore you will not get recruitment. Or we put in very unreasonable criteria in terms of inclusion and exclusion. And when you ask somebody, why did you put them in? They say, oh, I don't know, that's what I did in my last study. I just carried it over. We are not thinking, and we need to think about what do we really want in the study. It should be reflective of the patients that we are going to treat at the end of the day. We really don't want to make it too narrow a slice of the population, and then support the sites so we can get the work done. Dr. Patel?
Yeah, please, Dr. Patel, we would love to hear
Yeah,
you.
I think Dr. Dave, you actually hit the nail on the right spot. I would fault CROs and the pharma industry for their prejudice and for their kind of narrow-minded approach to this. And it's because you go to big tertiary hospital, they may have 50 trials for 10 patients. And in community clinics, even though like I have published about 50 papers, I had ESCO Merit Award during my fellowship for doing actually the one of the earliest studies on the immunoembolization of uveal melanoma before even anybody thought of doing immunotherapy. I was a lead publisher in the tumor-infiltrating lymphocytes and its relevance in IL-10 production in melanoma. But no pharma or CRO came to us for clinical trials once I came to community sites. It's inherent prejudice, I would say. And the other thing is, it's almost like I scratch your back, you scratch my back. So the CROs will go to site they're familiar with. But what we end up in doing is, and TJ, this is most important, is that we create disparity which leads to earlier death because there has been direct link to access to clinical trial and the higher mortality in cancer patients. The less access you have, the higher mortality you have. Also, the trials are, I would say, to a certain extent fraudulent, because if you test a drug in multiple myeloma, which affects 20% of the African American population,
Mm.
drug called Ninlaro only had 1%
Yes.
African American population. So we are perpetuating the healthcare disparities. We become part of this racial disparity that continues, and I would blame squarely the pharma industry and the CROs because they work hand in glove. I would say that if you go and look into the belt in the South, beginning from South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, there are people who are trained. My partners are trained at Johns Hopkins. Dr. Nadu was trained at Johns Hopkins and Thomas Jefferson. He was PI during trials during his fellowship. He used to write protocol. But CRO doesn't come to us, and it's simply because there's inherent prejudice. So I would say that we are sustaining and we are actually perpetuating the disparities which leads to early mortality in people who are underserved, underprivileged. We have to break that. It's possible to break that.
Actually, I agree with you both in that regard, and especially it's a phenomenal timing and the awakening happening because of the COVID-19 pandemic, right? And the challenges with the health systems and the challenges with the infrastructure and the overall positive moment in addressing health disparities and racial sort of, disparities, right? And one of the good examples is BMS announced a really good sort of an initiative, how we can really look into ways in engaging more and more diverse populations. And technology has a role to play because it's data-driven insights and outcomes we're trying to bring. Dr. Bowen, if the question is very much, timely based on the discussion, also speaking about how do you believe, right, as you see on the question, community sites are embracing technology. I also think one of the biggest challenges is the operational sort of, complexities involved in screening, pre-screening, and matching the patient. And also, I really think, based on Dr. Patel's comments, the one of the internal discussions we had, how do we capture information to make sure that diverse populations are also being involved in pre-screening, screening, because as we all know, majority of the patients fall through the cracks because of the complexities involved in trial sort of screening. If you don't mind, please, address the question followed by Dr. Patel. Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you, Kamala. Just to follow up on the previous comment, I do agree. And I think that a lot of the bias has to do with just kind of traditional channels that are open. So a lot of the studies go back to traditional relationships that they have with PIs, and they don't necessarily look for where the patient populations exist for the specific studies. It's mostly epidemiological data that they're looking at, not necessarily current data. So I think that leads to the problem. And to address the question that's on the screen right now, I think more specifically, we are starting to see institutions starting to embrace technology a little bit more. Healthcare though has a lot of inertia that moves in a certain direction, and it's hard to change the direction of that. I think we saw that, years ago when the movement came for electronic health records. There was a lot of resistance for good reason to move to electronic health records. But once something catalyzes that, which is in that case, it was the government catalyzing the move to electronic health records, people start to slowly move and they start to see some of the benefits. I think another catalyst is COVID. We're starting to see this change the way that health has to be provided. There is resistance, and some of that is very, good reasons to have resistance. But I think once people start seeing the benefits, they're starting to see this and as a way to break down some of those barriers in doing remote care and doing telehealth and those kind of things. One of the big issues has always been data security and patient privacy issues. But I think a lot of the precedent has been historical in that things are changing. The security out there for cloud-based infrastructures is becoming really good. There's always going to be breaches. You can always point to the news, but given how much information is out there right now, I think the number of breaches is still fairly low. But we are starting to see that. I'm very curious to see as we come out of COVID, if the movement that's gone towards some of these less on-premises solutions, the more digital solutions if that stays. And I'd love to hear, Dr. Patel or Dr. Dave talk a little bit about that as well.
So I think, let me take, because Dr. Bowen, you addressed something very well. It's actually the familiarity factor that actually perpetuates the whole kind of ecosystem, but it leads to two big issues. One is industry suffers because of the lack of appropriate patients that actually qualify for the trials. 1 in 4 trial never completes itself. Second is there's a huge delay in the trial accrual because of the, again, lack of number of patients versus number of eligible trials. But if you look into the proportion of disparity, if you look into, you've done research on BRCA1 and 2, BRCA affects probably 0.001% population. And we have like 10 drugs.
Right.
Sickle cell disease, how many people does it affect? And how many drugs? In last 100 years, we only have 1 drug.
Right.
And so this shows the inherent bias of the pharma industry. I want to put square blame on them as well as CRO both, because I think, again, they work hand in glove. I mean, I hate to use this word, but it's the rare combination that perpetuates each other's interest, but which completely turns blindfolded eye. Now, with the technology, of course, things are improving, but before DPlus came, there was a company called Diverse. Do you remember they were trying to come into the clinical trial space for the matching?
Yeah.
I was interviewed by a journal called Oncology Times, and I was asked to say what was my take on Diverse. Diverse, their model was that they had accrued certain big cancer centers as their kind of site for trials. And they said, we'll charge $4,000 per patient who wants to go to the clinical trial space. And I said, so again, there's one more healthcare disparity. There's not a single patient in my community can afford $4,000 for being participant in the trial. And none of them can afford to travel to Duke for the trial. So coming back to, we have to democratize the resources. What's happening is we still have capitalization of the resources for the drug development, but which is hurting the society. So I think if you look into COVID-19, I think trials are not efficient because they are not getting appropriate number of minority participation that FDA has asked them to do. So I think we have to learn how to break these barriers in trials, and the biggest one is still there is unusual lean towards those big hospital systems and health systems, and it will perpetuate the eternal problem.
No, that's true. No, thank you for those insights, really. Dr. Dave, any comments here, please?
No, I agree with you. I mean, this is, certainly from the pharma side, this has been a big problem. In fact, at the end of the day, even though for many decades, it is not an issue in terms of their profitability, but we are now seeing this in the last several years, the way we are running clinical trials and the inefficiencies of running clinical trials have really stretched the timelines in drug development. And at the end of the day, from the pharma side, time is money. If we can't develop a drug rapidly, we are losing patent life. And then if you try and burden the drug in the last 5 or 6 years of its patent life with all the time wasting you did earlier, it's a very expensive drug. People can't afford it. So if we can change that paradigm and move the studies along a little bit faster and make them more real world, then I think we can shorten the time to development. The data, I think, actually will be quite attractive to the regulatory agencies, and we can really turn this industry around. It's the way we are going right now is not viable. We cannot continue on this paradigm. The paradigm has to shift. We've got to do something different.
Thank you, Dr. Dave. And then it will lead to next question about the bottlenecks in patient recruitment, right? Why there are so many bottlenecks, and based on your experience, what are the few factors, kind of allude to that, or really, stand out, and why? I would like to hear your insights, followed by Dr. Bowen in this regard.
In that, I think, again, it's a good question. It goes back to the earlier comments, which is that we are not talking to and working with people who want to do research. There are those who want to do research who are out in the community, and we basically shun them. We want to go and talk to a big key opinion leader, and that's great. They have great ideas and they're very useful, but very often you don't get the recruitment. If you want to get recruitment, you got to go to the oncologists who are seeing patients day in, day out, and not just seeing patients 1 month of the year, and then the remaining 11 months they treat a mouse. So it's community doctors we got to be working with. We need to encourage them, and we got to allow them to participate and actively encourage them to participate in the studies. But on the other hand, if you're running an office, and I have never run an office, so Dr. Patel can probably sort of correct me if I speak inappropriately here. But when you're running an office, you have many other things you have to attend to. The last thing you sometimes want is a CRA coming in or the CMO.
Oh my God.
Bothering you. It's such,
Tell me about it.
so
Tell me about it.
yeah. And so we need to, from the trials viewpoint, learn to have a light footprint. We cannot barge into offices and disrupt their day's activity. Otherwise, the doctor will say, I don't want to deal with this anymore. I've got too many other things going on. So we got to make our protocols more user-friendly, make them lean. And I think having learned from COVID-19, we really need to go through every protocol and take out of there the unnecessary visits, the unnecessary blood tests, the inappropriate form filling. And even at a very basic level, if, for example, Dr. Patel's site has participated in the study once, he's already shown he can do it. He's got all the capabilities, all the papers have been filled out. Why should every pharma company now that wants to participate in a heavy amount of trial, companies say, Dr. Patel, we got to come to your office and make sure that you got a desk and you got a refrigerator and you got a patient examination room where you see patients. He's already in the office. He's got all these things. Why are we making people jump through hoops to get into studies? So those are some of the bottlenecks. And then the other area which I think is becoming more and more critical is as we move into precision medicine, we are no longer talking about just saying, give me a lung cancer patient, give me a breast cancer patient. We are saying, I want a lung cancer patient who has EGFR mutation, who does not have ALK mutation, and maybe has got high PD-1. I mean, we put lots of restrictions on there. And if you're going to put those restrictions on there, then we got to find those patients. And having found the patients, we have got to go to the patient and not ask the patient to come to us. I mean, that thought process has to change. In community networks often can do this way better than we can, so long as the support is there. The network can come together, and then it doesn't matter which office within that network the patient is going to, you now have access to the patient.
I agree 100% with Dr. Dave. I mean, you nailed a lot of the elements that I would say as well. I think importantly, you said initially, finding the right patients that fit the demographics that Dr. Patel talked about earlier, that's a big challenge. You have to go to the community to do that for the reasons you mentioned. The challenge you also mentioned, though, is that, finding the details around a patient, given the movement to precision medicine, is becoming much more challenging. I would even say the way that protocols are written needs to change. They're frankly just lazy. They say a patient can't have had a prior therapy with a tyrosine kinase inhibitor. How many nurse navigators know all of the tyrosine kinase inhibitor drugs that are available? They shouldn't list the drugs. They shouldn't list the target. It's just some of these things have to change. So those are, to me, the same bottlenecks I would say as well, and the number of drugs that are reaching the market and the number of drugs that are available continues to accelerate. I agree with some of your earlier statements that the training that oncologists are getting is great now. It's very good, but they're still not always geneticists. They're still not always aware of basket studies that are available for, one of the different indications that they might be a specialist in. So as things move forward, I think we have to support those community settings where all of those patients exist with tools that can help them in order to do that. And also pushing on the pharma companies to help get better protocols in place and digitize the protocols and do things like that will help everybody.
I think Dr. Bowen, sorry, Kamala, I just want to interfere here because I think they both made a phenomenal point. One point that you made was that the CRO space is perversely incentivized to bill on a time. So like attorney, they want to bill on a time. So they don't have an interest in efficiency for the trial. Second thing, what you said was that if a site has done one trial with the technology, all you need to do is to create a central portal of the sites and all of my 1572 forms, my GCP compliance, my OHRP certification. With the technology, you just need one say common central portal, and all that you need that to do site initiation. But coming back to, so I'll give you real life example, Dr. Bowen. So I was involved as a consultant to one of the large hospital-based GPO. They were talking to a company, you probably have known about them already, for molecular diagnostics. This company was asked by FDA to get 100 blood samples in a strack tubes to look into the transport stress so that they can validate that the cell-free DNA was viable in that particular transported specimen. They went to their health systems year and a half. They could not get 100 systems. So I've known them for 3 years, but again, like usual, they were falling back on the teaching hospital health system. So finally, they came to see me in the middle of COVID about in June. Last week, we finished all 100 samples that they needed. So now they've come back with what you're saying about they need 75 samples on multiple different mutations. And I said, yes, I can do that. I need to first screen every chart, and that's what DPlus come in place. So I said, we need to screen every patient's chart, look at the PDF report, create the OCR so that we can convert the PDF report into the Word document. I can actually create the, we have capacity. So I have about 1,000 employees overseas that work for us in different kind of technology species. But my point was that something that the company had to delay their commercial asset development by over a year and a half simply because they leaned onto the wrong side of the history. And when they saw that what we could deliver, now they want me to take on a trial that's, I mean, just the basic study for validation of their quantifiable RNA and then cell-free DNA for over like 2,000 patients. And I said, I can do it in 6 months.
Wow, no, that's great. That itself speaks about how technology can be leveraged.
Technology.
Yes, yes, certainly. And I agree. And I think it's these registry studies, right? Wherein obviously the term registry is kind of, I think it has more expanded role, right? Even before a trial, I would love to see a lot of the pharma players or even the diagnostic players in relation to their filing process. You first need to understand the heat maps. Where are these patients, right? And it's very important as a part of, say, if it's a diagnostic player for their clinical validation, there itself is the number one aspect where the biggest challenge is why people delay forever in developing a CDX is one area, companion diagnostic, what I mean. There is so much opportunity for technology to bring in those real world insights in an accelerated way. So that explains definitely, and that would also give opportunity for having deeper insights, say from a precision medicine perspective or immuno-oncology or CAR-T perspective, which are very complex areas to understand, say if it's a oncologist, right, or a hospital system, they can understand their patient pool and it can be leveraged as a dashboard to the sponsors, which is pharma or CROs, and for providers, basically it is a very deeper insight of what they're good at, what sort of patients they're looking into, what sort of workflow process amendments that they need to bring in. TJ, anything you want to comment here? Because it's very timely based on our experiences with various projects.
Yeah, I think that, the technology is just, it's changing the game. We see a lot of groups that are trying to adopt technologies to help with this process. But I think it's actually more valid to hear from the MDs on this topic than me. We can talk all day about this, but the guys who live and breathe it, I think, are going to have a great opinion on this.
So let me take these. I think because you bring technology piece. So before I go there, Dr. Mandal, you brought up the idea of the registry, and the registry has changed a lot since 21st Century Cures Act was passed. Registry before that was totally different. After that, FDA has defined the role of registry, which includes EHR, which includes disease registry, drug registry, and they actually could be part of the approval process. And if you look into the Pfizer getting approved for the Ibrance and the male breast cancer was based exclusively on the prospective registry on the patient, male breast cancer patient. They didn't do any phase 3 trial. So FDA has been very brave in putting it together. And I think the question is, how does DPlus or maybe, Dr. Dave's idea about the development of the new molecules, how can they combine together and reduce the drug development process, the disease development, the test development process using the data and the platform that actually would help us much better representation of the samples. You could come and put an EHR or maybe your portal into my clinic, and how my clinic can then find patients that you could just do just in time trial. For example, I may not have patients with MAT mutation, but if there's one, you could just open up just in time trial to reduce the burden to the pharma partners to open like 1,000 sites. They could just open just in time trial. So, and I'll leave it to Dr. Dave now for your comment here.
Yeah, I think the point you make is very good. I mean, and I like the idea of leveraging the numbers because the patients, obviously, the community are scattered. Even in academia, they're scattered between many different physicians, and we often don't have a good idea as to who has got what. And not only that, we often struggle with knowing when a patient is likely to become available for a trial. So, for example, if I come in and say I want a third-line breast cancer patient, I need to know who you have in second line so that as they become available, we can pull them in. But it makes a lot of sense rather than still focusing and making it site-centric is to actually make it patient-centric and say, yeah, here's this vast group of patients across the country. All of us are using either a EMR of one kind of or other. Few people are still using paper notes, but there's a way of translating their information. Can we not capture that information and basically have a eye open to say where are people in what stage of the treatment, what markers have been collected, what information is available, so that is when the study becomes available, literally at the press of a button can say there are 4 patients available today in this and this practice. I mean, so you can then basically go to them, do it just in time, get that patient on the trial, and so you're not putting a great deal of burden on the site. You're not burning a huge amount of money just wasting monitoring hours, and yet you got all that information that you need to move the study along in a very timely fashion. I think that could actually move the needle significantly. In
Dr. Patel and Dr. Dave, those are great points, and actually those are things that we're working towards at DPlus. We do offer just-in-time development and feasibility assessments based on what you just talked about. Within our database, we can collect pathology information, we can collect molecular data and EMR data, and the system can constantly search behind the scenes so that it doesn't have to be actively managed by a physician or a nurse, and it can propose when these trials are coming available for these patients with very specific characteristics. And you mentioned it earlier, Dr. Patel, it's also something that we can work with networks on and manage their 1572 documentation and get central IRBs in place so that when we do find these patients, it doesn't take months to get a site activated. It can take weeks.
Exactly.
So, Dr. Bowen, I think this is very timely to really, take the audience through Viper, which actually addresses this very aspect and challenge that we're talking about, right? That integration, and which is the key part of pre-screening and also even for real-world insights, right? All of this, it's such a versatile application. At least today, shall I go to the slide which speaks about how Viper works and might be explain what Viper is?
Sure, I'd be happy to talk about that. Yeah. So, I think we've all talked about some of the issues here, and we've seen this play out, and we're very mission driven to get the right patient, the right therapy at the right time. And the way Viper works is that's exactly what we do. We go into hospitals and institutions and community clinics and community networks, and we let them have our software to use at those sites for this very purpose. We integrate with their EMR systems, we integrate with their pathology lab systems, and we can even integrate with third-party molecular vendors when they're not doing that in-house. What we do is we capture all of that data. We have our own data model where we'll collect that information, manage it, and then surface it back, initially for trials, but eventually this can be for, marketed therapeutics as well. But really looking for those across those protocols. We take in all of those inclusion and exclusion criteria. We work with the PIs of the studies, and in the cases where there's sponsors, we also work with the sponsors to get the latest protocols, really understand how we're going to match the protocol to the data, because believe it or not, it's not always apples to apples. The protocol might ask for something that you can't actually get in the data the way it comes. So we have to figure out how that data actually comes in. And we do those mappings. The system is constantly searching, as I mentioned before, for patients behind the scenes across those networks. And if patients are identified, we surface those patients to whoever the right person on that care team is. If the care team is set up to have clinical research coordinators or nurse navigators that are looking for patients, we surface it to them. If the PI would like us to surface those patients to the PI, we can surface it to them as well. And then on top of that, we also know that no artificial intelligence system is going to capture all of the inclusion and exclusion criteria. It's just impossible. So we provide a workflow solution as well. And the workflow solution lets the clinical research coordinators or whoever's looking for patients, it can be the PI as well. It lets them actually mark off and have a checklist of the inclusion exclusion criteria, so we know when they get to the right point to make those patients approachable, get consent, see if they're interested in enrolling in the study and move forward. And we keep that data centralized. We find that it's just, it's really unfortunate, but a lot of people are tracking these things in really inferior ways. They're using, pieces of paper and post-it notes on screens, and you either have missed data, you have missed patients, you have gaps. You can't really look historically as a PI and say, well, how many of these patients did I really have? Because a lot of times, either you don't have access to the data, you have to go look it up again, or it's wrong. The data that's being captured isn't accurate. So we're able to kind of create that. And as this slide shows, we're capturing it from a lot of different locations, which means we have a lot of different methods to do that. And Dr. Patel talked about this as well with the technology. This isn't possible unless you're deploying a lot of different types of technology. We can look through, notes fields, unstructured notes, and use artificial intelligence capabilities like natural language processing and optical character recognition in order to get that data inputted. We can capture direct feeds. We can look at PDF reports from pathology or radiology and other groups and integrate all that data into a centralized model. And the centralized model, which is patient-centric, is really the key here. Because if you talk to people today who are doing the triage of trying to find patients, ask them how many systems they're looking in, right? It's never as simple as just looking in the EMR, unfortunately. A lot of times they're looking at imaging systems. They're talking to third-party molecular vendors. They're talking to the PIs or the oncologist that represents the patient to find out information. So it's just a big challenge that we're trying to manage.
So I also want to have one more comment here, Dr. Dave, because if you could just take one more step, Dr. Bowen, here, I'm thinking aloud. So to digress, if I can sell my house signing the DocuSign note for $2 million on my cell phone, why can't we have exhaust data structure which is in accordance with the protocol? So the whole burden of CRA going and bothering me on my clinic for 4 hours, instead of that, according to the protocol, every 3 weeks evaluation, you just pull out the structured notes from my EHR and put that exhaust data onto the onto the sponsor side, so that you have a regulatory grade, registry grade data that you don't have to worry about paying those guys who start driving from Greensboro for 1 hour. They'll drive 3 hours one way, spend 2 hours in my clinic, and bill the sponsor for 15 hours for a day. I think if the data company like that of yours can figure out a way of pulling out the exhaust data from the EHR, you complete the circle from the time of the site qualification criteria to trial completion.
Right. Absolutely. And that is the goal, right? That's what we're striving towards. And it's an iterative process. You continue to find things that you have to make inferences on in the data, but we're continuously doing that with a lot of really great PIs that stand with us and look at trials and say, oh, you're not going to capture this. As I mentioned, a lot of times the protocol asks for something, but that's not the way the data presents it in the system.
Exactly.
So you have to make that interpretation, and a lot of times that's not even something that an AI instrument is going to figure out. That requires a conversation to say, oh, when you're asking me about recurrence, I have to look at CA 125 levels, and I have to look at this and that and the other thing to make sure I understand that that is the recurrent of the same disease. So there's a lot of things that we have to infer, but you're 100% right, Dr. Patel. Creating that complete value chain is the goal, and that's what we're striving for.
Awesome. No, certainly. Thank you. And this will lead to a nice real life example that Dr. Bowen would like to share. Tell us about your success at Hogue Community Hospital and the poster that DPlus has recently presented at ASCO.
Sure. Yeah. So this was early findings, and we're progressing since here. But what we found is we wanted to work with a site that was really not digging as deeply as they could, and they admitted this. And what we wanted to do was say, how can we help with this process? And so we assigned a naive research coordinator to the site to manage several of the studies that were going on at an institution. And what we found was that one CRC was able to manage 20 studies at the pre-triage space. So looking across thousands of patients and getting them down to a reasonable number that they could actually manage across multiple different types of studies. This is the critical point. It takes, studies have been published in multiple journals, and the average is anywhere between 6 and 11 hours per patient for someone to triage them for a study. This eliminates a lot of the work there, because a lot of that is digging through these multiple different records. It's making sure that the timing is right. Have they failed a therapy already? What's the timing for when they're going to come off of this next therapy? So I have to identify a lot of criteria and then put them on hold and then come back and see if they're progressing or see if they're actually responding. So those are things that we can manage virtually that a person on the ground doesn't have to do. And what we found was that we were able to do this for 20 studies, as I said, across studies that included 12 different biomarkers, basket studies across multiple indications. And we're able to find 150 patients retrospectively, unfortunately, but 150 patients that went undiagnosed or unmanaged for studies that could have potentially qualified. So this just goes to show that if you enable the team with the right tools, as we've discussed on this call, you can really make it more efficient for them to manage these kind of things. And any community oncology group that hasn't had the luxury to do this could manage this as well. We just need to put the technology to power. So I don't know if you have thoughts on this, Dr. Patel or Dr. Dave, but these were things that I think would probably resonate with you, just given the conversation we've had.
Yep.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Dr. Bowen. The need is to get more patients into studies. And if we're going to move away from the 3 to 5% number, missing 150 potential patients is just a terrible shame. I mean, it's not really a shame in terms of doing the clinical trials, but it's a shame for the patient. I mean, we need to be able to offer, if there is no alternative therapy, some cutting edge clinical trials to the patients. If they want them, they take them. If they don't, they don't. But to not even offer them to them, I think is just a disservice we are doing to our patients, and that's something that's that sort of leak should be pluggable relatively easily, so that everybody has the opportunity to participate. And then it's up to the patient and the doctor if they decide to go forward. Just give them the chance.
I think, and then Dr. Bowen, you rightly said that with the platform that you have, and with the probably, like get the big pharma with the keyword, their association together, get the, maybe CRO people together and have them understand that instead of working like 40 years old archaic model, if you adapt technology very well, like DPlus or other technology, and bring everybody together and democratize the whole trial space. So, we have the trade organization like ION, the GPO, which I'm sitting on, like, on the as a medical advisor for the ION. We have COA, which is one of the association. We are always willing to open up our arms to somebody who wants to democratize instead of what we call the monopolize. What I've seen time and time again is, one company will come and say, we have this they'll come to Coa board, we open ourselves to them, and next thing you see, they sell themselves for $2 billion, and then nothing has changed.
Yeah, right. Agreed.
No, certainly. I agree. Actually, we received a decent number of questions, but also I just received comments. I think it was going throughout the presentation. They were like, wow, you guys are ahead. There are responses already to my questions. So, but there are a couple of questions that stand out. One of the questions I think both Dr. Patel and Dr. Dave can address. If we know that 80% of eligible patients are seen in the community setting, which such technologies like DPlus can leverage us to get that sort of a level of insight. Why has the industry not yet solved for this as of yet?
I can tell you from the industry side is I think it's just a lack of willingness to move to a new paradigm. If you've been doing something for the last 40 years, even though it's a broken model, there's a great deal of comfort because it's a model that you know. And you're asking people to change, and change is always hard, but it's got to happen. Dr. Patel?
I think I really admire your candidates and honesty coming from the industry side, because this is exactly where we see, I think, it's a broken record being played over and over again. I think they have to start thinking outside the box, and I would not be surprised if eventually FDA or NIH comes very harsh on the industry, because if you look into the COVID-19 right now, what I'm saying is that the delay in vaccine may be because they didn't recruit enough number of minority population. The state may come where FDA or maybe even Congress may start mandating that, well, if you do not have enough reflection of the representative minority in a trial, you may not go through a process. And it may take a piece of legislation to force them. If, almost like how President Reagan used to say, if they don't see the light, you make them feel the heat. Then they'll see the light.
Yes.
No, that's great. The open-mindedness both from the community leadership, Dr. Patel, and the industry leadership, Dr. Dave, is amazing. We will actually, go to the closing remarks, given the fact that it's only a couple minutes. Any one of you, starting with Dr. Patel, would you like to please give any closing remarks to the audience and every one of us, please?
I think I really admire DPlus and Dr. Bowen to come here and demonstrate the HOG and all the kind of innovation that they're doing. We need this, but the only suggestion I have is that don't just stop at the trial matching software. I think you need to go into the comprehensive solution, which includes the site qualification. So you create the glossary of the sites that can do trial, create the resume on the portal so that you become the clearinghouse for initiating the trial. And with, of course, with the CDX mod that we are looking into, companion diagnostics, you may have less patients at one side. So maybe just create the just-in-time kind of, structure where you locate the patient, you open up the trial at the site where the patients are, so that pharma does not have to wait. And coming back to Dr. Dave, your comment, if pharma gets one more year of the drug life on the patent life, they can save $3-4 billion. So for them, saving is not just in saving the money to identify patient, it's in actually getting extra 1 year of the patent life. And I think I'll pass it on to you, Dr. Dave, for the comments.
No, those are good points. And I mean, from my perspective, again, I think what you're doing at DPlus is very smart, because we need to change the way industry behaves. And I think the key is that we got to shift that paradigm from making it very focused on the PI and the bigger sites to actually saying it's the patient at the end of the day. The patient's going to participate, the patient's going to take your drug, and the data is coming from the patient. So make it more patient-centric. And anything that you can do using the tools and technology that you have, and sort of making that data portable, so that not only do you have it in the EMR, but the patient has that data as well. So if they go from site to site, the data goes with them. That would, I think, make it so much easier to recruit patients. And the patients will then, I suspect, be much more willing to play, as opposed to us going to say, hey,
Thank you, Dr.
great trial, but go 100 miles away for it. They're not going to do that.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Dr. Patel, Dr. Dave, and Dr. Bowen. This has been quite educational, and I hope let us all be the change that we want to bring in the patient's world. Thank you very much.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yes. Good luck, Dr. Patel, with your book.
Thank
Yes.
you.
Thank you both. I
everyone.
appreciate it.
Yes.
Thanks.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Have a wonderful day, audience. Thank you very much. Yes. Thanks for joining.